about facilitating hard conversations. I know that might seem a little bland, but it can definitely cover different topics, so I'll kind of go into detail about. So what are hard conversations and why do we need to know how to facilitate them? All of you, I'm sure, have been in some situation so far. If not, you definitely will be within your career in which you've had to deal with some sort of difficult conversation, whether it was dealing around like just a really hard social justice topic, or if it's just handling like mediating students or people that just aren't getting along. So say you have a student come into your office and they're mad, sad, freaking out, anxiety, and you have to kind of diffuse that situation. Or if you're dealing with multiple students who aren't getting along and having to kind of mediate that. Res Life, I'm sure you guys definitely experienced that with like roommate agreements and things like that. The thing that kind of got me interested in this was actually a specific situation with staff members. I was in a staff meeting and we had a staff member kind of say something that offended another staff member, and that staff member kind of like freaked out and blew up, and then all of a sudden the staff meeting turned into all of these people who were just yelling, screaming, and crying, and it was really, really hard. So you're going to be in these situations where you're the only person that's not screaming and crying. It's kind of your responsibility to kind of diffuse that situation. So we're all gonna, I'm sure we'll all kind of hit these strides many times in our careers. So I just wanted to go over some helpful kind of tips and skills that can be useful. So just kind of jot some things out there. What are some skills or attitudes that you guys think of would characterize a good facilitator? You can just kind of.
Non-biased.
Okay.
Active listening.
Okay.
Empathetic.
Empathetic. Anything else?
Understanding.
Okay. Yeah, so those are all really good ones. We're going to touch on some of those. We're also going to touch on a few others. Of course, everything is situational. Not every situation is going to be the same. Some of these skills are going to be useful in certain situations. Other skills are going to be useful in other situations. Some of you are going to be really good at certain ones and not as great as others. But these are just kind of the bulk skills and attitudes that tend to make your life easier if you're facilitating a difficult conversation. I also wanted to note, if you guys will just kind of take mental notes as I'm presenting these skills, think about if you see them like, oh, I'm really good at that, or oh, I'm really bad at that, or even, I never thought about that. Maybe, you know, this is a really good idea that I never kind of really considered. Just kind of take those mental notes because we're going to talk about it at the end. So the first thing, it's really important to ask the right questions. Has anybody ever heard of Socratic questions? Have you guys heard that term before?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So basically, it's just like a philosophical type of question. There's 6 different examples. So you have clarification questions. So these are, you know, why do you say that? Or maybe can you try to word that in a different way? That would be an example of a clarification question. Assumption questions. So why is this important? Or what can we assume from this? Asking those questions. Reason and evidence. So this is probably the one we do most often. Would be like, oh, can you give me an example of that? That would be an example of an evidence Socratic question. Viewpoints and perspectives, kind of self-explanatory, asking people what their perspectives, or maybe even asking them to kind of step outside of their box and ask them, oh, hey, what do you think such and such's perspective is in this? And then you have even questions about questions. So say you ask a question and people are discussing that, and you can come back and be like, why do you think I asked that question? Why is that question important to the conversation? So even questions about questions are important. Extended silence. We talk about this a lot. I know some of you say that you're not necessarily good at it. For the sake of this, I don't want you to necessarily think about when you're trying to fill silence or trying to get people to talk, but more so, we've mentioned this before, Dr. Perry has mentioned, just using that silence. And sometimes silence is necessary. That's definitely important in these hard conversations. Sometimes people need a moment to just kind of sit, and it allows the listeners to be able to really kind of process what's going on. So just being able to be comfortable in that silence and not necessarily trying to fill it is really important. So exercising empathy, this is another one that I don't necessarily want you to think about just being empathetic. Obviously, not all of us are super empathetic. It's not all in our top 5, and that's okay. I don't want you to necessarily think about having to be empathetic to be a good facilitator, but more so having the ability to ask empathetic questions. So an example would be, you know, if someone's saying something that they went through, okay, when did you learn that that was your identity? Or so just trying to like connect yourself through questions and not necessarily having to be an empathetic person is really important. Validating the existence of differing viewpoints. Sometimes this can be really hard, but it's really important, especially when say you have a group of 10 people and there's only one person that has a different viewpoint, it's really easy for that person to kind of feel marginalized and attacked. So being able to just, you don't necessarily have to agree with them, you don't have to defend them, but just making sure you acknowledge that there is a different viewpoint that exists. Not only is it going to make them feel validated by you, but it's also going to make them feel validated by other people if they are in a group. It's also really important if there's a viewpoint that's not being shared at all. So if you're in a group of people, kind of everybody tends to believe the same things, and there's a viewpoint that's not being brought up, it's really important for you to kind of, just as a facilitator, to be aware of the different viewpoints and to bring those into the conversation. Repeat. This is something that I feel is swept under the rug, but it's really important. Clarifying what people are saying, even if it's just, oh, hey, so what I'm hearing is that you're saying blah, blah, blah. Or, okay, so if I'm understanding correctly, you're meaning that this is, it goes back to validating that person and letting them know that you hear them, you value them, and that they're not just speaking to speak, but that you're actually paying attention to them. So kind of asking those repeat. This is also really important to just use for understanding. You don't want to repeat to sound redundant because that can tend to make people think that you're not paying attention. So just repeat to clarify understanding and not necessarily just to repeat for the sake of it.
Oh, what's a good camera?
So emphasizing relationship over conflict. This is one of my favorite things to talk about because I feel like it's not talked about enough. Being able to verbalize that you value a person is really, really important, and I don't think we realize how important that is to students. So I wanted to give an example. Over the summer, I was sitting in on a conversation. There were two students. There was a trans student and a student of color, and they had gotten in this super heated argument. And my boss, Emily, was the one kind of actually facilitating it, and I was just sort of there. And there was this one point where the person of color just kind of shut down, and he was like, you know what, nobody cares, I don't care, I don't even want to talk about it anymore. And all Emily said was, but I care. And when she said that, his face literally just kind of like lit up. And it was just the most like simple and subtle thing that she could have done, but she was able to let him know that it didn't matter that people were disagreeing, that their relationship was more important than the conflict that was happening. And that was a really, really powerful thing. So even if you disagree, even if you see students that are disagreeing, if you can try to let them understand that emphasis on relationship over conflict, it can really, really be important with facilitating these conversations. That kind of leads into this, so explore and emphasizing impact. If you have a student that's upset and they're just kind of, hey, I'm upset because of this, and you try to just shut it down, the student that may have caused that upset isn't really going to learn anything from it. It's important to kind of seek out that impact. So ask the student, hey, this was said, how has that impacted you? How has that really made you feel? Because if the student is actually hearing what they said, what they did, and how that impacted a person, it's going to have a greater effect on them than if they're just kind of being mandated to sit through what's going on, because they already know what's going on. Monitoring your own reactions. This is something that we don't realize and we don't think about, but everybody needs to do it. None of us walk around with mirrors in front of our faces all the time. We don't pay attention to our facial expressions, but it's really, really important to monitor your own reactions. If you're sitting in front of a group of people and you hate Trump and someone says, I love Trump, and you go, like, of course, like, that's gonna make that student feel really uncomfortable, and they're never gonna wanna talk again. They're not gonna feel comfortable coming to you. Being able to monitor your own reactions. Now, that doesn't mean concealing them altogether. It's really important for you to be relatable to your students. You want them to know that you do have emotions, but just being aware and being a parent and thinking about those things, and maybe not being overzealous when it comes to expressing your own opinion. Because at the end of the day, you don't want to express your opinion, you're there to facilitate. It's not about you, it's about the conversation that you're facilitating. This one's pretty self-explanatory. Avoid value judgment. You don't want to just come out and say, you're being real dumb right now. Like, that's not your job. Even if you think the person's being really dumb, we don't want to pass judgment. Setting guidelines is something that's really important. So setting guidelines you can either do at the beginning of a conversation. Obviously, we know that always doesn't work out. So say you're going into a conversation that you're facilitating. At the very beginning, you can say, okay, hey, so we're going to talk about some tense subjects. I asked, can we all agree that if someone is speaking, maybe let them finish before we respond? And you can set those guidelines to begin with. That always doesn't happen. Sometimes in the heat of the moment, people are gonna start interrupting each other anyway. So it's perfectly okay to kind of step back and like touch upon those again. Hey Sophie, remember what we said at the beginning, if you could just let Savannah finish, and when Savannah's finished, we'll give the opportunity to you. Because not only does that help facilitate the conversation, but it also makes both parties, once again, feel validated, which is the most important thing when facilitating these conversations. Extending the interaction towards a stopping point. So we all know that it's human nature to want to end conflict. How many of you hate conflict? I know Ariel. Yeah, it's human nature. A lot of people don't like confrontation. So when they're brought upon confrontation, they immediately want to shut it down. It's human nature, it's fine, it doesn't make you a bad person. And yes, we can agree that the goal of this, these kinds of conversations is to come to a healthy stopping point, but we don't want to rush to that healthy stopping point. Sometimes it's perfectly okay to, even if you think that the conversation's over, maybe drudging up some hard things again because you want to facilitate the conversation. And you can get a feel for when it's completed. Like we had that conversation at the beginning of the semester when all of us at the very beginning were like, can we just apologize and get it over with? And Dr. Perry kind of nudged us, and an hour and a half later, we all felt better. And you know when it's done, you know when it's really completed. So don't rush towards that, but know when the stopping point is, but there's no quick fix for these type of things. Asking permission, along with what I was talking about earlier when I used the example of my coworker, is something that I've personally seen make a difference. And it seems kind of silly, but if you're wanting to talk to a student, literally just being like, hey, do you mind if we talk about this? Or if it's okay with you, would you elaborate? Because you're asking their permission, you're giving your students a sense of control, you're giving them the feeling that they have to agree to something, and that can be really powerful. It's also really important to note that when you do this, sometimes the students are gonna say no, and that's okay. You can say, hey, Will, would you mind, sharing your experience? And Will might be like, no, I don't feel like it. And that's perfectly okay, and you have to know how to transition those conversations if the person doesn't want to talk. Recognizing the scope of the issue is also really important. So say a lot of these, especially when we're revolving these conversations around social justice and these topics that are just bigger than us sometimes. Say there are two students who are having some apparent sexism issues. Obviously, we know that sexism is a thing that has existed forever. It's probably not going to go away from this conversation. And it's just really important to kind of understand that. Now, you don't want to take away from it because of course it's important. Of course you want to touch on it. You want to dig deep, but it's also important to make your students aware of the fact that this is a process, it's an engaging journey, it's not a quick fix, and it's not going to happen overnight. So if you kind of set that attitude and go into the conversation with that, kind of just setting the tone with that to begin with, it might make the conversation a little easier to facilitate. Yes and statements, these are 100% hit or miss. I've seen these be really great, I've seen these be really awful. I put to the point of understanding because yes and questions, yes, Rosalind, I hear what you're saying, can you maybe tell me a little bit more? Not, yes, Rosalind, I hear what you're saying, I totally feel you, girl, the same thing happens to me. You don't want to make them into the one-up statements, you don't want to be a one-upper, you just want to use these for understanding, to validate, to make the listener realize that you are paying attention. And last but not least, you have to practice. Some of you might not have been in the situations where you've had to facilitate these hard conversations. You're not gonna be a great facilitator overnight. No one's a perfect facilitator. Everybody makes mistakes. Things are gonna get awkward. You're gonna say something that offends somebody, and it's perfectly okay. But as you go on through your careers, you're gonna continue to have these hard conversations, and the more hard conversations you have, the easier that it's gonna get. So don't be discouraged if you're kind of thrown into a situation where you have to facilitate conversations and they just go horribly and you feel like the students hate you and you're so bad at this, I'm never gonna facilitate ever again. Practice is, it sounds really cliche, but practice makes perfect, you guys, except not, because no one's perfect.